Hello, U.S. history students, and we are in the unit on industrialization. And today we're going to be talking about how industrialization impacts two groups. We've looked at how it impacts immigrants, and we talked about the importance of immigrants to industrialization. Today we're going to look at industrialization and how it impacts African Americans and women. Now, both groups are going to experience some advances during this time period, but sadly, both groups are also going to face a lot of discrimination and segregation. When we talk about African Americans, we're going to review what we talked about concerning Reconstruction and the years immediately following Reconstruction. Remember, Reconstruction is a failure because it fails to secure rights for African Americans or long-standing rights for African Americans. And of course, that's going to lead us to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Women, we talked about, women are also getting taken advantage of. We talked about how factory owners would often hire women and pay them less than they would pay men because of this idea that women work less than men, which is not true. Okay, so there are going to be opportunities, but sadly, we are going to mention a lot about discrimination and segregation as well. All right, now let's talk about African Americans first. After the Civil War, discrimination and segregation against African Americans intensified and took new forms. We talked about that during Reconstruction and especially after Reconstruction as well, when those new Southern governments made up of former Confederate leaders come back into power and they join the Democratic Party, okay, and how they're going to use the law to intensify discrimination and segregation against African Americans. Now, African Americans begin to fight back against this discrimination and segregation, but how they fight back is going to take different forms. African Americans are not going to agree about how to respond to this discrimination and segregation. We're going to see that again when we get to the Civil Rights Movement and we talk about guys like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Now, at this point in time, so we're still in the late 1800s, early 1900s. At this point in time, our two big leaders that are going to represent different opinions on how to deal with discrimination and segregation are Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Right? Now, Booker T. Washington was born into slavery. In fact, when he was a young boy, he remembers the Union troops coming in and basically telling he and his family that they were free. In fact, he was born into slavery in Virginia. His homestead is really close to Smith Mountain Lake. It's a great National Historic Site, really good little museum. They have a mock-up of one of the cabins that he possibly was born in. There's some great hiking trails around it, just a nice little National Historic Site. So if you ever get a chance to visit the Booker T. Washington Memorial, please do. It's a nice little site. Now, Booker T. Washington believed that the key to ending discrimination and segregation was through education, vocational education, and economic success. If you were educated, you could take that education and turn it into a career. And if you were a hard worker and you were you were educated, you were smart. If you were hardworking and you were smart, people would respect you and would treat you as equals. Okay? So for him, education was the key to ending discrimination and segregation. So much so that he founds a college down in Alabama, Tuskegee Institute, to specifically train African Americans, not only train their minds, but also give them some sort of skill that they could turn into a job. And he basically builds that college up from scratch. One of his more famous faculty members is George Washington Carver, who comes in with the science and agricultural departments and does like experiments with peanuts and things like that. So just a really, really good, hardworking school based on this idea that education will help lead to an end to discrimination and segregation. Now, on the opposite side is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois believed education was meaningless without equality. Okay, for him, how are people going to give you an education if they don't see you as equals first? We need equality first, and then use equality to gain a better education. He's not throwing education out of the equation, but he says equality must come first, then education. He helps found with a group of people the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Right? And their main goal was to fight for equality, and then use that to fight for education. But equality must come first. Okay, so the difference between these two, Booker T. Washington said equality will come through education and economic success. W.B. Du Bois said, nope, equality must come first. Then we'll worry about education, economic success. Nobody's going to give it to you unless they see you as equals first. Washington was the opposite, okay? If you're educated and you work hard, people will treat you as equals, right? Now, as a teacher, I kind of go with Washington, all right? Work hard, show people you're a good worker, show people that you have some sense, and they will treat you as equals. But I can see both sides of the coin in this one. Now, another key leader at this time is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells led an anti-lynching crusade and called on the federal government to take action. We'll talk about lynching here in just a second, but you can see from the pictures, and the reason I show you these pictures, not to glorify lynching, but to show you how horrible it is, and to show you how sad mankind can be. The fact that people would actually take pictures of these poor victims hanging from trees is awful. The fact that they would gather their families and their little children around is also terrible. And Ida B. Wells said, we need to do something to stop lynching. All right. And the government needs to get involved. Now, a lot of people have trouble remembering Ida and what she did. Okay. And I've come up with a little device to help you. I do not mean to be disrespectful when I say this. Kids have said it actually helped me remember it. So I'm going to share it with you. Ida B. Well, if I wasn't being lynched. Okay, that's how you can remember Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign. Ida B. Well, if I wasn't being lynched. Sadly, while Ida is trying to get the government involved to stop lynching and further equality between the races, we talked about this after Reconstruction. State governments in particular are using the laws to actually limit the freedoms of African Americans. So while W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Ida B. Wells are trying to use the law to further equality, some governments are using the law to further discrimination and limit those freedoms. One of the big things, and we talked about this with Reconstruction, is voter restrictions. All right, there were laws to keep African Americans from voting. We talked about you had to pay a tax when you went to the polls. You had to pay a poll tax. If you could pay the poll tax, you had to pass a reading test. And we talked about the discrepancies in the reading test, that whites were often given something easier to read than African Americans were. If you could pass that, then there were property owning requirements. And chances are there's going to be no newly freed slave that can meet all of those requirements. So sadly, they're not able to vote. And when people begin to criticize state governments and say, look, this isn't fair, you're taking away people's 14th and 15th Amendments, the state governments are quick to point back. Well, wait a minute, hold on. Everybody has to pass these tests. And if you don't pass them, you don't get to vote. And there are white people that can't pass these tests. And that's true too, okay? Especially poor white people. So the state governments are using the law to restrict freedom for African Americans, and then using the law to defend the laws that are taking those freedoms away. It's a very, very sad cycle. Number two, we mentioned Jim Crow laws. Okay, Jim Crow laws were passed to force separation of the races in public spaces, buses, theaters, schools, restrooms, restaurants, water fountains. Okay, and I'm going to come back and talk about the Jim Crow laws here in a second, but they led to segregation. They led to separation of the races in public places. Now, like I said, African Americans begin to try to use the law to increase their freedom. Right? They go and they challenge some of these restrictions in court. All right. And we're going to see guys like Thurgood Marshall emerging, Oliver Hill emerging. These are some African American attorneys that are going to begin to fight for an end to discrimination and segregation. Now, they're not going to come till later with the civil rights movement, but African Americans begin to enlist African American attorneys and white attorneys to help safeguard their rights. Sadly, all of that is going to be shattered with a key Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson. People began to challenge the Jim Crow laws and said, look, these laws are inherently unconstitutional. They're causing a separation of the races, and that's not fair. It's violating people's 14th Amendment rights as citizens. Well, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court said, no, those Jim Crow laws do not violate the 14th Amendment as long as separate but equal is maintained. Okay, so in this ruling, they're going to uphold the Jim Crow laws, right? And basically say segregation is legal and constitutional as long as separate but equal is met. All right, now I want to go back. I want to show you this picture right here, the water fountains. Okay, and I'm going to use this as an illustration to talk about what we mean in that ruling. Okay, clearly, who's got the better water fountain? The whites. Okay, it's got a nice covering on it. It looks cleaner. Okay, chances are that covering is covering a refrigeration unit to keep the water cool. And that's not what we see here on the colored fountain. Okay, people begin to point to this and they say there is clearly a discrepancy between these two water fountains. Well, what Plessy versus Ferguson says, those water fountains are okay because everybody has access to the water. Now, if African Americans didn't have access to the water, then you would have a case. But both sides have access to the water. It's perfectly legal. It does not violate the 14th Amendment, and segregation is fine. That's what we're talking about in this key ruling. Now, down the road in the 1950s, we're going to talk about Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education is going to overturn this ruling, but that's a topic for another day. African Americans face segregation and discrimination on an everyday basis, okay? And we use these two terms interchangeably, but there is a difference, okay? When we talk about segregation, we are talking about separation of the races, okay? Segregation refers to laws that were passed to keep black and white people separate in both public and private places, okay? Discrimination is the negative behavior directed at a group of people because of some physical characteristic. It could be race, it could be religion, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, okay? So segregation is a form of discrimination, okay? But when we're thinking when we're talking segregation, think separation. Segregation is separation. It is a form of discrimination, but the separation itself, that is what segregation is and what it's all about. We talked about the KKK after Reconstruction, all right? The KKK and other groups are going to use intimidation and violence to frighten African Americans and try to get them in line with this segregation and discrimination, which is why you have the lynchings, okay? That was a good example of how violence and intimidation were used to kind of keep African Americans in line, okay? These victims would be taken at night, all right? Oftentimes they were beaten before they were hung from trees, all right? And then it was done as kind of an example and a warning to others, don't repeat this. And that's why Ida B. Wells is so interested in ending lynching, because you have not only are people being hung, but they're being hung without a trial. And that's why she wants to get rid of it, okay? It's wrong on so many levels, okay? You're killing innocent people. You're, arresting them at night. You're kidnapping them at night. and then you do it without a trial. It's a sham. It's awful. It's awful, and that's why she wants to bring attention to it and get rid of it. The other group, all right, the women's movement. There are two key leaders in the women's movement, and this starts way back in the early 1800s. I told you when we were talking about the Civil War, as the abolitionist movement kicks up, a lot of women are asked to join the abolitionist movement. And the idea is if we fight for greater rights for African Americans, then we can use those same arguments and fight for greater rights for women. So, two of the early leaders in the women's movement are Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to organize something we call the Seneca Falls Convention. All right, and we'll talk about that in just a second. She is joined later on by Susan B. Anthony. Okay, Susan B. Anthony works with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and works on the women's suffrage movement. Now, suffrage is the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony gets in trouble in the 1870s because she voted for Ulysses S. Grant. And she was a woman, and women aren't supposed to vote. In fact, she was fined and maybe put in jail for the night or something like that. But she did vote in one of the elections for Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. Now, the Seneca Falls Convention was held in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And it was a convention that was going to fight for greater rights for women, especially the right to suffrage. Okay. And suffrage is the right to vote. And women were arguing, like, look, you begin to see more women entering the workforce. You begin to see more women leaving the home and working outside the home. And women were arguing, look, if we can work outside the home and we can do all these other things, then we deserve greater rights. Okay. And if we can join unions and we have a voice in the union and things like that, then we should have a political voice as well. We should have the right to vote. So that's where this desire comes from. The women's rights movement is going to benefit from very strong leadership. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, all these women are very, very strong and very, very dedicated. And because they join crusades like the Abolitionist Crusade and things like that, they're going to prove that they're strong leaders. And if they can fight for those causes, they can fight for their causes as well. Okay, so if they can fight for abolitionism, they can fight for women's suffrage as well. So they're going to benefit from very, very strong leadership. Eventually, like I said, we're going to see a little progress. The 19th Amendment gets passed in 1920. The 19th Amendment is going to give women the right to vote. And what's interesting, it's going to give all women the right to vote. Now, remember, the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Well, now the 19th Amendment will give women the right to vote. That would include African American women if they could vote. Now, remember, there's voting restrictions and things like that. But African American women would be included in this as well. All right, due to a combination between the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. All right. So that's it. Real quick summary for how industrialization is impacting both African Americans and women. There are steps being taken. There is progress being made for both groups. Okay. African Americans are joining the workforce. Okay. Along with women. Sadly, the discrimination and segregation is going to increase. For women, we begin to see a little bit of progress thanks to the 19th Amendment and then getting the right to vote. It's going to be harder for African Americans. And that's going to lead us down the road, like I said, to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s.